Hello, this is Mr. Goldberg with just a little bit more information about the Iraq War. To get to this document, go to bit.ly/Timmy Iraq, capital T, capital I. And for students in my U.S. history class, that's because we wrote letters to Timmy, explaining the Iraq War to him. So as you go through the document, this is an explanation of how the U.S. got into the region, and we backed Iraq when it fought a war against Iran for 8 years. About 1 million people died. It was a pretty awful war. Not much change. The border between Iraq and Iran is about where it was before that war happened, and you can look into more details about concerns that Saddam Hussein had. He's the leader of Iraq, and he's a Sunni Muslim, and Iraq is mostly Shia, and Iran had its Iranian Revolution in 1979, and that probably explains the 1980 timing. And you can see here these red things are where Iraq uses chemical weapons, and I'm not sure if Iran used chemical weapons as well, but that's the start of sort of WMD type stuff. So that war ended, and the U.S. was backing Iraq during it, and again, this is sort of the background, the ethnic makeup of Iraq. The Kurds are up in here, and then these are the Sunnis, and then these are the Shias, and then a lot of this land here is desert. And you can look at that a little more on your own. Sorry about that shakiness. It mentions Yazidis on this map, and we saw Yazidis in, it's going all over the place, I apologize. Yeah, up here where it shows Yazidis, up here, we just saw a video of John Kerry going to visit Iraq, and if you click on that link, you can, it starts talking about persecutions against Yazidi minorities. So Iraq is now a pretty big mess. And what happened was that after the Iran-Iraq War, Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, took over this little country here with lots of oil. And Iraq succeeded in invading Kuwait. Some people were saying that the U.S. prevented that invasion. We did not. Iraq took over Kuwait, and then the United States, along with the United Nations and other nations, in conjunction with the UN, said we are going to contain the Iraqis and then eventually push them back out of Kuwait and into Iraq. And that's how we got troops in Saudi Arabia. And some people were talking about their troops being in Iraq, I think, but this is, Saudi Arabia is the country that borders to the south here. So Saudi Arabia allowed French and U.S. troops here, and then here we have Egyptian, Syrian, and Saudi forces, and it's a international effort to kick Iraq out of Kuwait and back into Iraq. And then after that war, that's where we had, sorry again for the jumping all over the placeness here. After that, that's where we get the no-fly zones and the weapons inspections and the sanctions. And let me grab a map that shows the no-fly zones. Hang on one sec. Okay, so these are the no-fly zones, and the idea is the U.S. and the UN could have pushed all the way up to Baghdad and taken Saddam Hussein out of power, but we decided not to do that, and we decided to let him still rule his country. He can't fly up here because we're trying to protect the Kurds, and he can't fly down here because we're trying to protect the border with Kuwait, and I'm not sure all the reasons that they wanted the southern fly zone. You could look into that a little more if you want. But in addition to the no-fly zone, there are regular weapons inspections and also some sanctions placed on Saddam Hussein. And so basically and then this is another detail you might want to look into. I didn't mention this when I was teaching, but Saddam had plotted to kill the first President Bush, who defeated him in that Gulf War, 1990 to 91. And you can click that link and read more about that. But basically, there were these weapons inspections that went on in Iraq off and on for 12 years in Iraq. And then 9/11 happened, and that really changed things. And when the United States was attacked by Al-Qaeda, the war on terror started. And what brought us into Iraq was President Bush making his State of the Union address in 2002 and identifying an axis of evil. And that's made up of North Korea, Iran, and Iraq, which is probably the least powerful of those nations. And this is in his State of the Union address in 2002. You can look that up. There's also some evidence that's come out later that said President Bush started planning for the attacks in Iraq even before 9/11, and you can click that link and look around for some others. But a point a number of you missed in your writing is that first we went to war with Afghanistan. We didn't wait very long for that. The 9/11 is obviously 9/11, 2001. By October of 2001, we had mobilized and went after Afghanistan because it was harboring terrorists, Al-Qaeda, who had attacked the U.S. And under the Bush Doctrine, you can attack such people. The WMD claims came later, and that was in 2002 and then early 2003, and that's where the record gets a little murky, and you can look into that a little bit. This is a fascinating article about on the 10th anniversary of the Iraq War. How do we teach it? The basic answer is we don't. Most classrooms don't have time to do more depth, the sort of depth that we're doing here on the Iraq War. And this was a really interesting exchange from early in the Iraq War. I'm going to do this on the video, but I need to change the size of my screen, so hang on a sec. So this is from Parents Magazine, and I'm not sure what the date is. It has to be in 2003, shortly after the war started, because it says, you know, Mommy, why are soldiers fighting in Iraq? And you can read this on your own. I'm not going to read it to you, but basically she's trying to describe this to a 6-year-old son. And I gave you Timmy as an 11-year-old, but how do you explain to a 6-year-old who is very perceptive and sees that it's on the news all the time, and you don't want to go too much into the nitty-gritty of the war, and so how do you do this? And so why is everyone always talking about Iraq and talking about weapons? And then this is a great question here. How do we know if he has weapons? And then it talks about the UN, and they have huge cameras, that Iraq might have weapons. And then they're looking, and they found a few weapons, and the United States thinks he has more. But the question to look into is, where did that intelligence come from? And then will other countries go to war too? We talked about France, Germany, and Russia being opposed to the war. And then will the U.S. win? We're the strongest country in the world. There was little question that we were going to win. But I thought this gave a really interesting perspective, sort of a time capsule from 2003, explaining to a small child what's going on in Iraq. So again, the way to get to that is go to this fascinating exchange and click on the link, and you can get more details about that. And this is a pretty good 4-minute video about ISIS and the Iraq War. What I really like about the video is at the end it says we did our best to compress a really complicated situation. We had to simplify some stuff. And it talks about things you might explore more. And that's what I hope you do as you're learning about the Iraq War, is ask more questions and get more details. But in order to tell a coherent story, I think you have to start with the first Gulf War. And it's good to have the background of the Iran-Iraq War before that, and knowing that we were supporting the Iraqi side during this battle. So one other just quick point to put this in Cold War perspective. As you know, throughout the, let me get a Cold War map here. So here's a pretty good Cold War map. And so the blue areas are with NATO, and the red areas are with the Warsaw Pact, which really is, this is the US, UK, France. and this is the Soviet Union primarily. And they're fighting against each other up through 1989, and maybe as late as early 1991. The Iraq, the first Persian Gulf War, is the first time that the Soviet Union cooperates with the United States and says, yeah, international boundaries matter and we shouldn't go invading other countries. So when Iraq invaded Kuwait, it was changing international boundaries, and that was seen not to be okay. In 2003, the United States attacks Iraq. We don't look to change their boundaries, but we do overthrow Saddam Hussein, and there are questions about whether that is legal in international law. And if you look up what the Soviet Union is doing, the former Soviet Union, Russia, is doing in the Ukraine now, there might be some connections there. Sort of when can nations use force, and when can they not do that? But again, I hope all this raises a number of questions for you and prompts you to learn more about the Iraq War. So thanks for watching.